December 7th, 1941. A day that would forever alter the course of history. A date etched in infamy, marking the moment when the world was thrust into a new era of conflict and uncertainty. The world watched in stunned silence as Japanese forces unleashed a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, plunging America into the chaos of World War II. The devastation was immediate and profound, with battleships ablaze and lives lost in an instant. But the Pacific inferno ignited that day wasn't confined to a single act of aggression. It was the spark that set off a chain reaction across the globe. It marked the beginning of a far grander campaign, a ruthless and calculated Japanese offensive aimed at seizing control of Southeast Asia. This was not a haphazard series of skirmishes, but a meticulously planned strategy to dominate the region. From the bustling streets of Hong Kong to the steamy jungles of the Philippines, the Imperial Japanese Army, a force honed to a razor's edge, stood poised to strike. Their movements were swift and decisive, leaving little room for resistance. Their goal? Nothing less than the domination of an entire region, fueled by an insatiable thirst for resources, and driven by a vision of a new world order. The Japanese war machine was relentless, and its ambitions knew no bounds. This is the story of that invasion, a brutal symphony of conquest that would reshape the Pacific theater and forever alter the course of the Second World War. The echoes of these battles would reverberate through history, shaping the geopolitical landscape for decades to come. The Japanese invasion of Southeast Asia was a whirlwind campaign of shocking speed and ferocity. The sheer momentum of their advance left their enemies scrambling to mount a defense. The soldiers of the rising sun swept through the region like a force of nature, overwhelming unprepared defenders and seizing vast swaths of territory. Their tactics were as effective as they were brutal, leaving a trail of devastation in their wake. This was not merely a military operation, it was a statement of intent, a declaration that the old order was crumbling and a new power was rising to take its place. The world watched with bated breath as the balance of power shifted dramatically. The stakes could not have been higher. The future of entire nations hung in the balance as the Japanese forces pressed their advantage. Southeast Asia, with its strategic importance and wealth of natural resources, represented a prize too tempting for the Japanese war machine to resist. Control of this region meant control of vital supplies and strategic positions. Oil, rubber, tin, these were the lifeblood of modern warfare, and Japan, an island nation with limited resources of its own, desperately needed them to fuel its ambitions. The conquest of Southeast Asia was as much about securing these resources as it was about expanding territory. The stage was set for a clash of titans, a struggle for survival and supremacy that would leave an indelible mark on the world. The battles that followed would test the limits of human endurance and reshape the destiny of nations. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe to MacArthur Warfare for more tales of history and warfare. To truly grasp the motivations behind Japan's relentless march across Southeast Asia, one must first understand the precarious situation the island nation found itself in during the tumultuous 1930s. This was a period marked by global economic depression, political instability, and a fierce competition for resources among the world's great powers. Japan, an island nation with limited natural resources, was particularly vulnerable to these global pressures. Japan, a latecomer to the game of empires, was hungry for the resources and prestige that came with colonial possessions. The Meiji Restoration had set Japan on a path of rapid modernization and industrialization. But this progress came with an insatiable appetite for raw materials. The Japanese leadership, both political and military, saw the acquisition of colonies as essential to securing the nation's future. She yearned to stand shoulder to shoulder with the Western powers, to command respect and influence on the world stage. The Western colonial powers, with their vast empires, were seen as both a model and a rival. Japan's leaders believed that only by expanding its own empire could Japan achieve parity with these Western nations and secure its place in the global order. But Japan faced a critical problem. It lacked the raw materials, the oil, the rubber, the iron ore needed to fuel its burgeoning industries and sustain its military ambitions. The Japanese archipelago was resource poor, and the nation's rapid industrial growth had only exacerbated this scarcity. Without access to these essential materials, Japan's economic and military power would be severely limited. This resource scarcity wasn't merely an economic concern, it was an existential threat. The Japanese leadership feared that without secure access to raw materials, the nation's very survival was at risk. This fear was compounded by the global economic depression, which had led to a sharp decline in international trade and increased competition for resources. The Western powers, with their vast colonial empires, held a tight grip on the flow of essential raw materials. The British, French, and Dutch controlled much of Southeast Asia, a region rich in the resources Japan so desperately needed. The United States, with its own colonial possessions in the Pacific, also posed a significant obstacle to Japan's ambitions. Japan, dependent on these imports, found itself vulnerable to economic strangulation, its fate seemingly in the hands of its rivals. The Japanese economy was heavily reliant on imported raw materials, and any disruption to this flow could have devastating consequences. This vulnerability was a source of constant anxiety for the Japanese leadership. To make matters worse, the West, wary of Japan's growing assertiveness, imposed crippling economic sanctions, further tightening the noose around Japan's industrial throat. These sanctions were intended to curb Japan's expansionist ambitions, but they had the opposite effect. Instead of deterring Japan, the sanctions only heightened the sense of urgency and desperation among the Japanese leadership. These sanctions, intended to curb Japan's expansionist ambitions, instead fueled resentment and desperation, pushing the island nation closer to the brink. The Japanese people, already suffering from economic hardship, were increasingly supportive of the government's aggressive foreign policy. Nationalist sentiment was on the rise, and the idea of securing Japan's future through military conquest gained widespread acceptance. The Japanese military, increasingly influential in the government, saw the writing on the wall. They believed that Japan had only two choices: bow to the West's demands, accepting a future of subservience and mediocrity, or seize control of the resources it desperately needed by force. The military leadership was convinced that war was the only viable option. They believed that Japan had only two choices: bow to the West's demands, accepting a future of subservience and mediocrity, or seize control of the resources it desperately needed by force. The decision was not taken lightly, but the military leaders were resolute. They were prepared to go to war to secure Japan's future. The decision was unanimous. The Japanese leadership, both military and civilian, agreed that war was the only way to secure the nation's future. They believed that by conquering Southeast Asia, Japan could gain access to the resources it needed and establish itself as a dominant power in the region. Japan would carve its own destiny, even if it meant going to war. The invasion of Southeast Asia was seen as a necessary step to secure Japan's future. The Japanese military mobilized, and preparations for war began in earnest. Southeast Asia, with its rich bounty of natural resources and its strategic location astride vital shipping lanes, beckoned like a siren song. The region's oil, rubber, and other raw materials were exactly what Japan needed to sustain its industrial and military ambitions. The strategic location of Southeast Asia also offered control over key shipping routes, further enhancing Japan's strategic position. For the Japanese leadership, it represented the solution to their resource woes, the key to unlocking their imperial ambitions. The conquest of Southeast Asia was seen as the answer to Japan's economic and strategic challenges. It was a bold and risky move, but the Japanese leadership was determined to see it through. The invasion, then, was not merely an act of aggression. It was an act of desperation, a gamble to secure Japan's future in a world rapidly spiraling towards war. The Japanese leadership believed that they had no other choice. They were willing to risk everything to secure the resources and strategic position they needed to ensure Japan's survival and prosperity. Like and subscribe to MGOTV History Warfare for more stories.